Hello, everybody. My name is Shama Venkateshwar. I'm the Director of Research and Programs at the National Council for Research on Women. Very warm welcome to you all. I hope I've had a chance to see some of you, if not all of you, at our panels from yesterday and certainly all day today. It's been really inspiring, terrific lineup of speakers, and I'm so glad that you've all stayed, and I hope you will all come tomorrow as well. You know, we've had such recurrent themes, even though the panels have been different, with different issues and different focus. Some very common themes have come up, and I hope you all took note and come away inspired with what those themes are and what it means for each one of you to take action in your lives. But one thing that I heard was that this is a historic moment. That came up over and over again, that even though that we're in the midst of this global financial crisis like possibly never before in the scale and magnitude and depth, there is opportunities in this, and opportunities for change, an opportunity for reconstructing a social agenda that is sustainable and more encompassing than it has ever been. And I heard that very clearly. Someone called this a Roosevelt moment plus. If some of you were there at yesterday's opening plenary, that came up. And why was it a Roosevelt moment plus? Because that moment when it happened, when it did not include women or communities of color. And hopefully going forward, an agenda that we set forward now will rectify and address that. So how do we translate this mobilization, this awareness that now exists, this energy that now exists into public policy that is encompassing and that has a social bent to it? How do we translate this then into the next step, which is the global arena? How do we make sure that everyone has a chance at the opportunities that might exist and everyone has a say in participating and in decision making? We'd like to actually hear about how American feminists working on a progressive agenda can come together with activists from the global south. What are those issues? What does that agenda need to look like? What does that kind of mobilization and alliance building need to look like? What are the strategies to achieve that? And what are the experiences that exist that connect the local to the global? How do we manage to bring the issues that matter to different people everywhere up front and center, put it within an agenda if we can, and actually move that agenda that might make sense? We have a terrific lineup of speakers today, and I'm so glad you can all join us. But just on some housekeeping changes, there's been a few changes to the lineup of speakers from what exists in your agenda, so let me just note that for you. Charlotte Bunch, Geeta Ragupta, and Alyssa Trotz unfortunately could not be here for emergencies that they had, and they send their deepest regrets and warmest wishes. But we have two terrific speakers to take their places. Cynthia Enloe from Clark University. Some of you may have heard her this morning on the Women, War, and Security panel. And you know, all of you know that she's a terrific speaker and a great mind. And Radhika Balakrishnan from the Marymount Manhattan College. And she's the incoming executive director of the Center for Women's Global Leadership at Rutgers. She's on our panel as well. Isabel Coleman from the Council on Foreign Relations will moderate this terrific lineup, and I'm going to have the greatest privilege of introducing this panel and Isabel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. It's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon with this terrific panel. Before we all got together, we had a conference call about a week or two ago to talk about this panel, and it was a somewhat heated exchange on the phone call, prompted by the title of the session, A New Agenda for Global Human Rights. I think if I say it this way, it might be less incendiary. A new agenda for global human rights, with a question mark at the end. And that was the compromise we came up with at the end, that there is a question mark at the end of that. Is this a new agenda? And what is the agenda? Whose agenda is it? And I thought maybe we'd start with Lamia to just give your perspective on this framing of the issue to start with.
Okay, well, thank you. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to come and speak in front of this very exciting, engaged audience. I think we need to first clarify the differences in the frameworks of human rights that are used by human rights actors on the ground. I'm a cultural anthropologist, so I work with people who are working with different frameworks, and what I'm interested in is how a discourse changes on the ground, how it's appropriated, how it's transformed at the ground level. So there are perhaps 3 levels at which we can look at the global human rights discourse, and it is true, it has become globalized as a discourse, but the practices and how people are interpreting human rights at various levels and across space is very different. So one is to look at the UN-mandated human rights discourse, which is based on the idea of an autonomous and individualized subject of rights. Now, this rights-bearing subject does not often correspond to the lived realities of the subject on the ground, who may be struggling for rights as well, but is located within other kinds of structures, such as familial, kinship, community, or ethnic identity-based structures and values. And so how does this discourse of rights, which is talking about individual rights, right, translate on the ground? The second is to think of the human rights discourse promoted by the World Bank, the US government, and other bilateral aid organizations. And here we run into more problems, because they're also using this idea of rights and tying it up to development dollars in many parts of the global South. And for many people who are also actors on the ground, this is closely tied to imperialist goals. And we know about that because the US has gone to Afghanistan. I mean, the idea of US Marines saving Afghan women in itself, I don't know who said that, is an interesting and kind of a funny comment, right? If we believe that that is what is happening. But it is also tied to resources that many organizations, human rights organizations, need to be able to implement some of their own agendas. So there is a kind of an ideological conflict, but often what is interesting to perhaps look from an anthropological perspective is how is it that people are maneuvering within a field of what I would call restricted possibilities. The third is one that I am most interested in, is really what I would call a grassroots indigenous human rights movement that is organized around not the human of an individual human, but based much more on a group rights basis. And that sort of, which is taking up these rights discourses, but trying to sort of renegotiate with the realities on the ground in terms of the communities that they're working with. So that's, I think I'm going to sort of add one little thing, and we can come back to other points later, is the work that I have done previously that sort of brought me to the human rights work was on microfinance in Bangladesh, which is the paradigmatic site of microfinance with the paradigmatic institution of microfinance, the Grameen Bank. And this is something we can talk later on or during Q&A, but the idea that microfinance, which is giving small loans to women, is a human right is a very interesting concept. And I think as feminists, we need to really go beyond the rhetoric of the empowerment of women. We need to ask carefully, what does it take to empower women? Is money enough? What does it mean to give women access to capital without giving them skills training, which is the Grameen Bank model, because it's based on neoliberal principles of ideas such as the borrower knows best. So if you give them the money, they will know what to do instead of the organization trying to figure out what they need. My book is coming out through UC Press in spring 2010. It's a radical critique of this model, this particular model, not all models across, that other organizations are working with. But I think, I'm willing to talk about that later on, but I wanted to put it out there because this has become a very innovative way of framing how women, especially in the global south, and especially very poor women, will be economically and socially empowered. So that's...
Thank you.